In this lesson, we're going to talk about another group of selectors called pseudo-class selectors. The name might sound a little bit complicated, but the underlying concept is actually very simple and useful. So let's define an article with 2 paragraphs. Now let's generate some dummy text here. Good. Now let's say we want to style the first paragraph and make the font bigger and italic. Here's one way to do this. We can give this paragraph a class, like first. Then we go to our style sheet and define a style for paragraphs with the class of first. Here we can set font size to 140%, so it's larger. And we can set font style to italic. Take a look. That's what we get. Very nice. Now, as I told you before, when we use class selectors, it's often a good practice to drop the element type. So if tomorrow we change the type of this element to something else, our rules will not break. Now, in this particular case, it doesn't really matter as much because it's very unlikely that we're going to replace a paragraph with something else. But I'm going to drop it regardless. Now, this rule will apply to any element with the class of first. What if we want this rule to be applied only to our articles? Well, here we can type the article element to give this a context, okay? So here's a basic way of doing this. However, the first step here was unnecessary. We didn't have to assign this element a class because in CSS, we have a bunch of pseudo classes that are automatically applied by the browser. So pseudo classes are not real classes that we define. They're classes that browsers apply by default. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to remove the class attribute. Now back to our style sheet. Instead of using this real class, we're going to use a pseudo class. All pseudo classes start with a colon. And here we type first child. Now, look, we get the same result as before, and we didn't have to assign a class to the first paragraph. What we have over here is called a pseudo class selector. So just like we have class selectors, we also have pseudo class selectors. Now, this first child selector is very useful, but it's a little bit fragile. Let me show you what I mean. So back to our markup, let's add a heading here and see what happens. See what happened? The first paragraph is no longer styled. The style that we defined is now applied to the heading because the heading is the first child of this article. Let's verify this. So right-click on the heading, go to inspect. Now, over here, look at the rule that we just defined. This rule is applied to the heading because it's the first child of the article element. So this is the problem with the first child selector. If we move elements around, our CSS rules may break. So here we can use another pseudo class selector called first of type. Let's see how this works. So back to the browser. Look, both the heading and the first paragraph got the style that we just defined. What is going on here? Well, let's inspect this element one more time. So in this article, we have one heading element and 2 paragraphs. This pseudo class selector, first of type, is applied to the first occurrence of elements of different types. So here's the first H2 that we have. That is why this rule is applied to this element. Now below the heading, we have 2 paragraphs, and the first paragraph received the style that we just defined. So this pseudo class, first of type, is applied to the first occurrence of elements of different type in a container. Back to our style sheet, we want this rule to be applied only to the first paragraph in our article. So here we have to specify the element type, which is P. Now, back to the browser. Look, the first paragraph is italic, but the heading is not. So this is how first of type selector works. Now, similarly, we have 2 other selectors called last child and last of type. Let's look at an example. So if you want to style the last paragraph in this article, we can say article P colon last of type. And here we can set font weight to bold. Now, look, the last paragraph is bold. Now, in this particular case, because this paragraph is the last child of the article, here we can also use last child. We get the same result. However, as I told you before, first child and last child are a little bit fragile, so if you add or remove elements, our rules may break. For example, if you add an anchor here, see, the last paragraph is no longer bold. But what about the link? How come the link is not bold? Because here we're targeting a paragraph that is the last child of the article. Currently, the last child of our article is not a paragraph element. It's a hyperlink. If we want this rule to be effective, we can remove the element type. And now this rule is applied to the last child of the article, irrespective of its type. So save the changes. Look, the link is bold. Now, sometimes we want to style elements based on their position in a container. For example, let's say we have a table or a list, and we want to highlight all the odd items. So here I'm going to define an unordered list. Inside this list, we're going to have 5 list items. So li times 5. Now, in each list item, we want to have some text like item 1, item 2, and so on. So here in braces, we can type item followed by a $sign. The $sign will be replaced by the numbers 1 to 5. So press tab. Here's what we get. Beautiful. Now we want to style all the odd items in this list. So back to our style sheet. We grab an unordered list and then select list items that are odd. So here we're going to use another pseudo class selector called nth child. Now this selector is like a function in programming languages. So in between parentheses, we can pass a value or an argument. So if you specify odd, this rule will target all the odd items in our list. So here we can set the color to deep pink. Take a look. Note that all the odd items are pink, and also the entire list is in bold, because now the list is the last child of the article element, okay? Now, similar to odd, we have even. Now, all the even items are styled. We can also use a formula here, like 3n. This will select every third item in our list. It's not something that used that often, but just be aware of it. We also have a few pseudo class selectors for working with hyperlinks. For example, look at this link. This link is currently displayed in purple because it's visited. This is the default color that browsers apply to visited links. But I don't like this color. I think it's ugly. So to select visited hyperlinks, we can type a:visited and then apply a style here. We can set the color to something more interesting like Dodger blue. Okay, now look, this is much better. But what about a link that we haven't visited? So let's change the href here to https some weird website we haven't visited.com. Okay, look, this is the default blue assigned to hyperlinks. Once again, I don't like this color. So here we can add a comma and select all anchors that are links. This link pseudo class is automatically applied to all hyperlinks. Now, take a look. That's much better. But what about the hover effect? Let's say when the user hovers their mouse over this link, the color should change to pink. So here we can say a:hover. This pseudo class is applied when the user hovers over an element. It doesn't have to be a link. It can be anything, a div, a section, an image, pretty much anything. Now here we can set the color to deep pink. Now, look, that is much nicer. But let me show you something. We can use the tab key to go over some of the elements on this page. As you probably know, some users prefer to use keyboards. So if we press the tab key, our hyperlink is in focus, but the color hasn't changed. So as a best practice, whenever we use the hover pseudo selector, we should also use the focus pseudo selector. This pseudo class is applied when the user goes over the elements on the page using the tab key. Now, save the changes. Take a look. We can use the tab key to select this link, and now our link has the right color. So this is all about pseudo classes. Next, we're going to talk about pseudo elements.